just a few reflections on some provisions in bank policies and the issue of customary rights relative to indigenous peoples. And I've sort of coined this as somewhat of a two-way connection. I mean, policies do state provisions about what to do. I mean, policies are quite prescriptive about how to respect customary rights. Customary rights are embedded in several bank policies, and for indigenous peoples there are special safeguards, and there is a need for particular attention to customary rights of indigenous peoples. We find in the cases I'm referring to that some of these prescribed safeguards were not applied, or they were not applied effectively. Then there is the second dimension, that customary rights also appears as one key criterion in the policy of identifying communities that are covered by the indigenous peoples policy. So it also becomes an issue in a screening process for when to apply this policy, which is a particular issue in regions where maybe the term indigenous people is contested or have particular challenges. So I've just quoted the language from the policy, which also is important in the sense that when someone complains to the panel, it also often is the aspect of customary rights to land or resources which defines the potential or actual link between a project and harm. And we have cases where the triggering of the IP policy itself was an issue. Now, when we look at issues of customary land use, there are references to this in several bank policies. And the involuntary resettlement policy of the bank, it covers legally recognized customary rights, and also people who occupy land without a legal title. So that can become an aspect when there is a resettlement going on. And it also deals with involuntary restriction of access to legally designated parks and protected areas, which can also be a restriction based on customary access to these areas. And the policy then prescribes a participatory resettlement process aiming at livelihood restoration for affected communities. There is also reference in the environmental assessment policy, the forest policy, the natural habitat policy on land rights, broadly defined, including in some instances customarily defined land rights, and a requirement to consult and take community views into account. Finally, on the policy of indigenous peoples, there are a sort of higher level of standards. There is a requirement to ensure that there is a broad community support through a process of prior informed consultation, and also a requirement to mitigate harm for affected communities, as well as providing social and economic benefits. So there are a number of safeguard measures that are embedded in bank policies, depending on the context that we have in the project. Now, panel cases, maybe two very broad lessons that we have seen is that dealing with customary rights is obviously a very challenging issue. There are often strong commercial interests involved. There is a population pressure. There is encroachment into land that has been held by certain communities under some sort of traditional tenure arrangements. It's often politically controversial. There are weak legal frameworks, and vulnerable and marginal groups, including indigenous communities, are often powerless in this situation. We have also found in the cases we have had related to these issues that the World Bank's involvement has often been appreciated, because people do consider that without the World Bank's involvement, the situation might have been even worse. But there is a need for a more careful attention to safeguards in these projects, and especially to manage the risk for vulnerable communities. And let me just then mention two sets of projects that both have come to the panel. These are two land administration projects in Latin America and projects on forest concessions. The land administration projects focusing on strengthening tenure security, and the forest concession related projects with the objective to establish sustainable harvesting of forests. Just very briefly, I would not go into details, but we have had two cases, one from Honduras and one from Panama, both related to land administration projects. Both had an emphasis on individual titling, but there was also an aspect of dealing with collective lands and claims to collective ownership to land. What the panel observed in these cases, that the latter aspect of projects seemed to gain lower priority during implementation of the projects, that the strong emphasis from the project authorities and implementers were on achieving targets for individual titling. At the same time, these areas were also subject to rapid encroachment by non-indigenous users through land transactions, and indigenous groups were fearing loss of substantial amounts of land over time. Lessons that came out through findings from these investigations is related to how to create a fully participatory process of identifying and demarcating land and land under collective tenure. This was an issue in the Panama case, where the panel found that at least for some of the communities, that process was not put in place. And there was also an issue about the indigenous people's plans or frameworks, that the project in Panama in particular had decided not to develop a self-standing indigenous people's plan for the project. The panel, and I think management, also agreed that it would have been better to actually have this self-standing planning process, not least to ensure a better participatory process of identifying collective lands. There were also issues about ensuring broad representation of communities. There were contestation even among indigenous peoples themselves about who could represent the communities and how. So this was particular challenging issues, and according to panel findings, more could have been done to ensure a broader representation. Finally, and in both projects, there were also concerns raised about the bank's analysis of existing legal provisions, and also changes in domestic laws during implementation of the project, and the consequences these changes had for indigenous people. On forest concessions, the panel has had two cases, one from Cambodia and one from DRC Congo. And in both cases, there were issues about recognition and protection of communities' use of forest resources. In the Cambodia case, the complainants raised issues about illegal felling of resin trees that many forest communities and indigenous communities depended on. And the issue in DRC was broadly the issue of recognition of Pygmies as an indigenous peoples and their rights and usage of forest under forest concessions. Both investigation reports, in fact, also raised the issue of the focus on poverty alleviation, which is maybe a broader concern that is maybe not so directly enshrined in bank policies per se, but also questioning whether these projects were too much technically oriented towards promoting forest concessions rather than how this could be an instrument for alleviating poverty in the forest areas and how to involve local forest-dependent communities. Some important lessons that came out of this investigation was the need for better and proper screening of what communities would be protected by the indigenous peoples policy, such as the Pygmies in Congo. And an important outcome of the investigation was a stronger recognition in DRC for the status of the Pygmy as an indigenous community. There was also, in the two projects, no preparation of indigenous peoples' plans or frameworks, and also not enough of legal analysis of the protection of customary land use and land rights. Finally, there were also issues raised about how to assess and value non-timber resources versus the valuation of timber resources for commercial exploitation. And finally, also, particularly in the Cambodia case, that the project should not have relied solely on environmental assessments prepared by forest companies. So, with these lessons, I hope that others can contribute and also maybe reflect on how these were brought forward in later projects of similar nature within the bank. Thank you.